Welcome everybody. I want to do two things. I'm going to talk for 8 or 10 minutes, something like that. And I just want to say something about what this is, that we're looking at what this project is, where it fits in Duchamp's book. And then I want to talk about the issue of reproduction, very briefly, in Duchamp's work. This is the boîte en valise, literally the box in a suitcase, which Duchamp began, he conceived in 1935, and it occupied him until the end of his life, in '68. It was a very, very slow, painstaking process to produce these. He was intimately involved in the production. I'll say more about that a little later. It was an edition, there was an edition of over 300. There was a deluxe edition which actually had a leather valise, really more of a briefcase than a suitcase, of 20, and then there were 4 that were not part of this numbered edition. And most of these went to collectors and friends of Duchamp. The first one went to Peggy Guggenheim, for example. And then there was an edition, in all there, basically 7 series of this, edition that was not in a leather suitcase, but was in really a kind of cylinder box, such as you have here, which is lined with linen. And this was an edition of 300, broken up into 6 or 7 series. So what is in this box in a suitcase are reproductions of 69 of Duchamp's works. 69 works, 66 of which date between 1910 and 1923, which is really the core of Duchamp's achievement. Duchamp basically, as he says, he gave up art for chess. Basically, if Duchamp had died in 1923 at the age of 36, his position in the history of art would not have been altered. And so, one of the ironies, one of the many ironies in Duchamp's production is that he spent 33 years making reproductions of works that it took him 13 years to make. And then he does it, when he first conceives this in 1935, he writes to Catherine Dreyer, who's one of his major patrons, and he says he's thinking of making an album of his works, but he conceives of it, at least the part that you see here, it's really like a miniature gallery installation. Now it's important also to state that when Duchamp conceived this project, and in fact even when he finished the first one of these valises in 1941, none of his works was in public collections. In 1935, he had never had a solo exhibition. He had his first solo exhibition in 1937 at the Arts Club Chicago, 12 paintings between 1910 and 1914, which are included here. And so, effectively, this was the first time, there were no monographs on Duchamp. This is the first time that one could effectively, if one happened to own one of these things, get an overview of Duchamp's production. The way that he set this up here, and this is only true of the sort of opening of the thing and the rest of it. What you see here, these panels which pull out on the sides from behind the large glass, which is his major work there in the center, which is on plastic, a reproduction on transparent plastic, is the way it was set up. These two, the Mona Lisa and the bottle rack that's ready-made, are just these sort of loose reproductions, and that's how most of the things in the album were. But for the opening, he has this sort of miniature installation, which I think that it's interesting that he does it this way rather than as a monograph where one sees it as a book, where one goes through and sees a sequence of reproduction, because I mean, the term conversation applies to this event. Well, this is, as I see, the sort of conversation that Duchamp has set up between these works. and the way that I'm inclined to read it without having thought about this a great deal, but that the works that are shown here, which you have the bride, you have the king and queen surrounded by Swiss nudes on the left. The center, as I said, you have the large glass. The bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even, the full title of it. You have 3 ready-mades on the left hanging on the wall. You have another ready-made, which is a dog comb here on the right, and then a tomb, a painting in the Yale University Art Gallery there. 9 Malic moles, which is a work that relates to the sort of predates and anticipates a motif which he uses in the large glass. You have, so these are the ready-mades. The first one, I mean, he didn't think of it as a ready-made at the time, the bicycle wheel coming in 1913. But you have the ready-mades, and then you have these paintings which sort of point the way to this large project. For example, you can't see it where you're sitting, but the bride over here on the left is a motif which is then incorporated into the large glass. Lying flat here, you can't see it, but this is part of the way you can see this design, this structure, is this coffee mill. And the coffee mill from 1911 is really the first painting that Duchamp makes where he begins to get involved with the mechanical. And this metaphor of the mechanical will become a metaphor for sexuality, which is then reaches its full realization in the large glass going through the bride, the king and queen surrounded by Swiss nudes and so forth. And then next to it, at a vertical, is the second version of the chocolate grinder, which also figures in the large glass there at the bottom. You have another 3 standard stoppages over here on the left. And then here, one of his earlier paintings from, I think it's 1911, the Sonata, which represents his early, sort of somewhat earlier work before he goes off. So anyway, this is an ensemble which sort of sets up connections, energies that existed between these works and the kinds of relations they had to one another. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the issue of reproduction in Duchamp's work. And Duchamp is a complicated guy. Let me just read you something that André Breton wrote in 1934 called The Lighthouse of the Bride, which is, as far as I know, it's the first article that makes claims that Duchamp is a major 20th century artist. I mean, you won't find a lot of reception, you won't find a lot written about Duchamp until really after the 1930s. His work can't be seen, it's in private collections. Most of the works, in fact, 28 of the 69 works here were in the Ahrensburg collection. And the Ahrensburg collection went to the Philadelphia Art Museum. Duchamp, this anticipates quite wonderfully one of the many anomalies of Duchamp's work. Duchamp doesn't have a dealer, doesn't have a gallery, doesn't, as I said, doesn't have a solo exhibition until 1937, and even then that's very small, but Duchamp is in a sense the curator of his own production. And so that's already represented here in this box, and it anticipates what will happen when the Ahrensburgs bequeath their collection. They had lived in New York, then moved to Los Angeles, major collectors of 20th century art, of which Duchamp was also the curator. Even though he spoke of being estranged from 20th century art, he was a great connoisseur of 20th century art. He put together this remarkable collection, which you can enjoy in the Philadelphia Museum. But anyway, when the Ahrensburg collection is bequeathed to the Philadelphia Museum in 1950, and then it's installed in 1954 by Duchamp. So he really becomes, as I said, kind of curator of his own production. The other collector who is best represented in this, and you see on the labels which he made, it gives the provenance of the work, is Catherine Dreyer, the Société Anonyme, and some of which went to Yale, but some of which, for example, the large glass one up in Philadelphia that originally belonged to the Ahrensburgs was sold to Catherine Dreyer and went back to Philadelphia. So the issue of reproduction is a really fascinating thing with Duchamp. And Duchamp, there's this statement by André Breton, which I'll come to now. In 1934, Breton, in this Lighthouse of the Bride, this essay on Duchamp, writes, "The practice of drawing and painting gave him the impression of being a confidence trick, aiming at the stupid glorification of the hand and nothing else. And if the hand is the main culprit, how could one agree to be the slave of one's own hand? It is preposterous that drawing and painting should still stand today at the point where writing stood before Gutenberg." Well, Duchamp had this fascination, as I said, with the mechanical and things, the ready-mades, for example, the bicycle wheel or the urinal, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment, which you see hanging beside the large glass at the bottom. There's a typewriter cover. His ready-mades were consisted of making art out of that which was industrially, mechanically reproduced, that which existed in multiple, in which the hand, that is, manual craft, was not at all present. In 1914, he has a series of notes, which he called the white box, which he reproduces photographically in an edition of 4. One of the earliest ready-mades, it consists of 3 reproductions of a landscape, a kitschy landscape, which he calls Pharmacy, which he hand colors. Then there's the Mona Lisa, which you see over here from 1919, where he draws a mustache on a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, and then puts this inscription, LHOQ, basically, she has a hot ass, or she has the hots, or however you want to translate it. But in the 1930s, when he does this, reproduction has become the major focus of Duchamp's activity. In 1934, he puts out the green box. And the green box is the notes that he made for the large glass between roughly 1913 and 1920. And since Duchamp put so much emphasis on the idea rather than the hand, you'd think he just published the book. But no, he makes this box with these loose facsimiles of his notes and drawings, and he makes templates for each of those original notes so that the facsimile, the template, a metal template, would be placed over the paper, and then it would be torn around to duplicate the actual shape of the torn paper. So this sort of fetishization of the materiality of the object would seem to be in contradiction with Duchamp's critique of what he called, I met him when I was a student, when he talked about the materialism of 20th century art. And yet Duchamp is really exalting the material here. So he puts out this arcane set of notes on the green box, which no one can see. No one can see this object. It was shown once in the Brooklyn Museum, then wound up in Catherine Dreyer's garage, broken, and Duchamp reassembles it in 2 months in, I think, 1936. There's an article on it by Frederick Thiessen in 37. Then it's shown at MoMA between 43 and 46. Then he does an edition of 500 roto-reliefs, as he calls them, these sort of optical things that were based on one of his cinematic projects in 34. And then in 35 he comes up with this. And this is the most fascinating of all, because, and this really makes, I think, Duchamp even more interesting than he already is, and a much more complicated guy, is that you would think that Duchamp, the post-Gutenberg visual artist, would be interested in up-to-date modes of reproduction. But the way that, and this is why this project is so long, all of the paintings were done by the collotype process, which is a 19th century reproduction process, photographic reproduction process, that was offset, excuse me, the pun, was replaced by offset reproductions around 1900. Then Duchamp, wanting to get the color exactly right, he's not going to settle for the state of color reproduction, does basically maquettes showing color coding, which goes to artists who use stencils to hand color with watercolor, each of these reproductions, which is why they look so great and so fresh. So incredibly exacting. My favorite, though, is the fountain, the urinal, which looks like a mouse urinal in this scale. Strangely, he doesn't have it on its side. He puts it back up so that it could be functional. Again, only for mice. But this, he goes to a warehouse in New York, and he looks at a lot of urinals before he selects this one. There's a wonderful monograph on this by Bill Pinfield. And then he selects this urinal. So, and the whole idea of the ready-made is it's a sort of instantaneous, arbitrary act of choice. And that the art is in basically the idea that is applied to him. He painstakingly constructs this out of paper mache. And then it's given to ceramic artists who then do a whole series of these things. So it took, one of these reproductions would take over a month to do with the hand coloring. So this is why this project took 33 years to basically reproduce 13 works. So Duchamp really seems to be focusing on these sort of old-fashioned idea, getting the color right, the craft of the thing, making the thing. It's a very, very much a handmade object. So I think I'll just stop there and turn it over to Ed.